Hi there, I'm the Reverend Danny Crosby, a Unitarian minister serving congregations in Altrincham and in Urmston in the northwest of England. And I'm offering this devotion as a balm for the heart, for the mind, for the spirit, and for the soul. And it's titled, Are You Awake? Consciousness and Self-Consciousness. The Sundays have been extra busy for me these last few months. After leading worship, Molly and myself have been going off to puppy school. Before Christmas she passed like an introductory puppy class, and these last few weeks we've been working towards the Bronze Award of the Kennel Club Good Citizen Dog Scheme. Now when working with her at home she's been doing great. The problem's been when she is with other dogs. When Molly is with other dogs, she just wants to play. She loves other dogs. All the commands have been going well. Well, except recall actually. In the park, when she's off playing with other dogs, she really doesn't want to come back. So recall's been a bit of a challenge too. But she just wants to play. Last Sunday was the examination for the Bronze Award. Things did not begin well. For some reason, she chose this Sunday to turn her nose up at the training treats that I had that she'd been liking up to now. No problem at all, she loved them. Now thankfully one of the other owners took pity on me and lent me some cheesy ones that she had for her dog. Molly loved them. I'm going to have to get some, I think. Anyway, the assessment began. I found myself feeling very, very anxious about it. Actually, I felt worse than when I took my driving test. But I kept on centering myself. I kept calming myself. I kept praying quietly under my breath, the fear prayer. I kept saying it over and over again to take away the fear. God, please remove my fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be. Molly was her usual calm self, just playing in between each different test with this beautiful little dog that she gets on with. Things went well. There was a moment during the stay command when the dogs have to stay still for 1 whole minute. Just as they were right halfway through it, a motorbike went past on the road by the side of the field we were in, and it misfired really, like a real loud bang. This caused a couple of the dogs to move from their position. Molly just looked in the direction of the sound and stayed still. She was brilliant. The only test that proved difficult was, of course, recall. I knew this was going to be the case. I had a feeling that we would fail on this. But she did come to me. She came in her own casual way. She didn't rush like the other overly enthusiastic dogs. But when I called her, she kind of sauntered towards me and came, and so I passed the test. We passed the exam and now we're going to move on to the Silver Award, which will begin in a few weeks' time. Now an observer who was helping out with the examiner and observing us throughout the test, she'd been the woman actually who instructed us in the initial puppy classes before Christmas. And she said some lovely things to me about Molly and our relationship together, how far we've come actually since those days, saying we must have been working really hard together and what a lovely relationship we have and what a little treasure she is. I can't tell you how much it meant to me. She seemed to adore Molly, which was great. And I know she'd observed me and my struggles with making sure I got things right. It was lovely encouragement actually, as well as passing the test, of course, which I'm so chuffed about. Now, one thing I've noticed since Molly came into my life has been an increasing old feelings of self-consciousness. Not so much about myself, although it is kind of really, more about how others perceive me through Molly. People do offer comments about her and myself all the time, mostly really lovely ones, but occasionally the odd passing comment which sounds critical, and I've occasionally taken those on board. But the truth is, she's a lovely dog. She's very calm, friendly, sociable and pretty fearless actually. She's smart too and she knows her own mind, so loving. She is not at all self-conscious. She is fully conscious, conscious of herself and the world in which she lives and breathes and enjoys her doggy being. She's teaching me so much. Molly is an absolute treasure, and she's fully awake. Now, as I was reflecting about all this earlier this week, I was reminded of a story that's attributed to the life of the Buddha. It is said that soon after his enlightenment, that the Buddha passed a man on the road who was struck by the Buddha's extraordinary radiance and peaceful presence. The man stopped and asked, "My friend, what are you? Are you a celestial being or a god?" "No," said the Buddha. "Well then, are you some kind of magician or a wizard?" Again, the Buddha answered, "No." "Are you a man?" "No." "Well, my friend, then what are you?" To which the Buddha replied, "I am awake." The Buddha was awake. He was fully conscious to all that is and all that will ever be. He was fully integrated. He did not see himself as separate. Well, actually, perhaps he did not see himself at all. It's not a claim I could make or could ever make about myself. I believe I am more awake these days than I have ever been in the past. But I am aware of my sense of separation too from time to time. That said, I am more conscious than I ever was before, I would say. And there's a simple reason for this. I am less self-conscious than I once was. Although I have been reminded of my self-consciousness a bit recently. Of course, I am not yet, and I probably may never will be actually, some perfectly self-actualized, enlightened being. But you know that. It's highly unlikely I ever will be, but I am not crippled by self-consciousness these days. Self-consciousness does not paralyze me, it does not control my life, although I am aware of it. I can live through it. I feel more connected. I feel at one with all that is. And I feel like this more than at any other time in my life, actually. Maybe that's why it feels uncomfortable when I feel somewhat self-conscious. I feel conscious. I feel awake. But of course, I used to be terribly self-conscious, and it ruled my life. And I suspect that it was this that was the very cause of so much of that aching loneliness that used to eat away at me and my being. I felt separate, I felt cut off, I felt alone. How many of us feel like this? It is the plague of the modern age, of humanity. And it's been interesting to notice how I've been revisited by some of these feelings recently. I've just been reminded of a taste of what it used to be like all the time. And it's only an essence of it, a taste of it, not anything like how it used to be. I was terribly self-conscious as a child. And there were many reasons for this, or should I say, I found many reasons for it. One being a birth defect that I had. I was born with some of the nerve endings at the base of my spine being underdeveloped. It was something akin to a less severe form of spina bifida. It was a form of that. As a child, I had to frequently go for physiotherapy, and there was a period when I was not allowed to engage in any sport activity for a whole year. And I hated the feeling it engendered in me as I looked at the other kids running around the playground, knowing I wasn't allowed to join in. Maybe that's why I get such joy watching Molly. Who knows? I know that feeling of not being able to join in. And it was a few years later, when in my teenage years really, the pain really hit me. I became increasingly self-conscious, and I was painfully aware of the way that I walked and the way I carried myself physically. I remember walking down the streets of the town I grew up in, and whenever I saw someone, particularly if it was a girl or girls walking towards me, I would try and stand up straight and kind of push my feet inwards in this vain hope that they wouldn't think that there was something wrong about the way that I walked and the way that I moved. And I must have looked a right sight. Drawing attention to myself, really, must have looked really weird. I mean, the truth is I was just so terribly self-conscious. I was just so locked into what I believed was wrong with me. Today I've come to understand that the problem was not actually my perceived physical imperfections, though. I suspect that if I'd been born without any of these physical difficulties, the problem, the self-consciousness, would have manifested in other areas of my life. I would have found something else. The problem was the self-consciousness. I was locked in myself, therefore not fully conscious. I felt separate, I felt alone. I blamed it on this physical thing. I thought that was the reason. And I don't today think that. And you know what I've learned? If I've learned anything over the years, the one thing I'm not alone in is this feeling. So many of us suffer from forms of self-consciousness. We feel lost, lonely, cut off because we're locked into what we believe is wrong with us. Sometimes it's harder to see what is right than what is wrong. And that feels so lonely, so isolating. It's no way to live. Socrates reputedly said the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, while not wishing to argue with the great philosopher, I do wonder sometimes if the over-examined life can prove just as worthless. It's so easy to get lost in oneself, to get wrapped up in our own underwear, and to such an extent that we do not live at all in this world. We can become so self-conscious that we fail to become conscious of all that is and all that has ever been. It's so easy to become wrapped up in our own perceived needs that we fail to live in this world with others, and then complain about feeling lonely. Yes, it's important to examine ourselves, to understand who we are, what makes each of us tick, but that should not be an end in itself, a destination point. It's a kind of staging point and an early adolescent one, I think, in the spiritual adventure, but it's certainly not an end in itself. Some have named this over self-absorption that's particularly plagues us in our modern age a kind of narcissism. You may remember the ancient Greek story of the boy who fell so in love with his own reflection that he fell into the water and he drowned. But I don't think this is actually that. It's not narcissism in that sense, or even the psychological sense, really. It's not correct to name this form of self-consciousness this way, for there seems very little love in it at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. The preoccupation is with what is wrong. When you look at your own reflection in the mirror, tell me, what do you see? Do you see someone that you love? Do you see who you really are? While we may see ourselves, warts and all that's wrong, how many of us actually see our beauty spots too? No. The self-absorption that most people I come into contact with, that they suffer with, tends to be a deeply ingrained negative type, a kind of self-loathing, really. The preoccupation is often with what is wrong with them, with their shame, what they are ashamed of in themselves, rather than how wonderful they are, or superior they are. And this kind of self-consciousness can become so consuming that it takes over our human interactions. I wonder how many of us suffer from this kind of commentary when we meet up with other people, when we walk into a room. What will they think of me? How do I look? If I say something, will they think I am an idiot? And then as it continues, he gave me a funny look. He must have thought me a right fool. Why on earth did I make that stupid remark? Gosh, I'm such a freak. Everybody's staring at me. That's what the dialogue I had when I used to walk down the streets of my town, and I'd see people walking towards me that I would soon interact with, or it was worse for me walking in the open, really, because of my perceived thoughts about my own physical being, my body, which I believed there was something wrong with, that I hated. This kind of inner dialogue can be so crippling. It can haunt us from the moment we wake and continue through our day, eating away at our every decision. Oh, and of course, because we doubt ourselves in every decision we make, we assume that everyone else must be doing exactly the same thing. This kind of self-consciousness can be so crippling that it blocks us off almost entirely from the world around us. When we become consumed by this kind of self-consciousness, we see the world from our own point of view, and our own point of view is not a pretty one. So what can we do about it? How do we wake up to a greater consciousness? How do we break free from this crippling self-consciousness? Well, here's a few thoughts. In the Gospels, Jesus taught his followers that they must lose themselves in order to be found. That by emptying ourselves of our self-absorption, we begin to be filled with the spirit of neighbourliness, so that we can look deeply into the still waters. And when we do, we don't drown. We're not drowning by our own narcissistic self-consciousness and the loathing of our own reflection, but rather by a deeper contemplation of our shared lives. Instead of just becoming self-conscious, we become conscious of all that is, all that has been, and all that will ever be. By opening ourselves to and for others, by seeing the bigger picture, the wider view, we begin to shed the debilitating skin of self-consciousness that we can be so easily be imprisoned in ourselves, locked in ourselves. Similarly, Gandhi said the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. The Buddha talked of nirvana, of being freed from the suffering that was the blight of humanity. He showed that we all suffered, and it was in seeing our suffering as individual that led to this sense of separation. We all suffer, but we experience suffering as an individual, it seems. He suggested that we needed to break through our suffering, not only to serve others, but to reach a higher state of being true consciousness. This is what being awake is, what he was talking about in that little story. Now, please don't get me wrong with any of these musings. I am not suggesting that we don't need to know ourselves. I'm not saying that at all. That we don't need to understand how we tick. What I'm actually saying is that we must not get stuck there. We must not get lost there. We must not see this as the destination, just to know ourselves. But it's a staging point on the journey, maybe the adolescent stage actually, the beginning almost. Sadly for many folk, including myself by the way, this adolescent stage often goes well on into adulthood, and maybe some people never leave it. So, the question, how do we move then from self-consciousness to consciousness? Well, I remember a few years ago reading Forrest Church's, most of his stuff, but particularly his book, Lifecraft, because in that he offered 3 simple suggestions for this, which he called the 3 E's. 3 letter E's. And the 3 being empathy, ecstasy, and enthusiasm. The key, he said, could be found in the literal understanding of these 3 words. Empathy, to suffer or feel with another. Ecstasy, to stand outside ourselves. Enthusiasm, to manifest the God, the theos, within us. I'll begin with empathy though. Empathy is a deep felt compassion. When we open our hearts empathically to another, we are courageously refusing to allow self-consciousness to stand in the way of a higher consciousness that comes into being when we feel what another is going through. In so doing, we serve both ourselves and the other person, as well as that higher consciousness beyond our singular selves. Now, ecstasy has often been misunderstood as some kind of hedonistic state, and therefore a form of self-indulgence actually. The truth is, ecstasy is far from this. In its truest sense, what it actually does is takes us out of ourselves and lifts us beyond the confines of our singular selves. In so doing, we transcend our self-consciousness and enter a realm in which purpose begins to emerge and meaning is found. Finally, enthusiasm. Enthusiasm means to be filled with spirit, to be filled with holy energy. Enthusiasm allows us to be fully involved and engage in whatever it is that we're doing. It allows us to see beyond the confines that we have created. Forrest himself states that here, once again, consciousness displaces self-consciousness. We escape from our mirrored room. Its mirrors turn into windows, or the pond grows so still that we see beyond our reflection to the trees and the clouds and the birds and the sun. There is, by the way, no higher form of spiritual practice. When we step out of our own shadow, consciousness replaces self-consciousness. So in so doing, we are set free to walk with others in our own faltering ways. Instead of being lost in what we believe is wrong with us, we are set free to do what we can in this, our shared world. And in so doing, we encourage others to do the same. But to do so as perfectly imperfect children of God. We enthuse them with our spirit, and that Theos spirit, that God spirit, comes alive in them. Lovely. For me, the purpose of the spiritual life is to develop a deepening sense of connection. We all have our troubles and our worries, either those within ourselves or the world all around us. We need to see them for what they are. We need to acknowledge the truth, but we must not get stuck there, for that will paralyze us and stop us doing what we can. We cannot change the way the world is, but that need not prevent us from doing what we can do. And in doing so, we will grow spiritually as we become integrated into what has been and all that exists and all that will ever exist. So there's Forrest's idea, and I agree with him. A solution to self-consciousness, a way to develop consciousness. The 3 E's, 3 of them. Empathy, ecstasy, and enthusiasm. Empathy, to suffer or feel with another. Ecstasy, to stand outside ourselves. Enthusiasm, to manifest the God, the Theos, within us. So I'm coming to the end of these thoughts, really. So I'm offer a kind of conclusion, I suppose, these final thoughts. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. You know, I think so much of modern spirituality gets it wrong because it's seeking the wrong thing. There is so much talk of finding ourselves, when in actual fact what we ought to really be doing is losing ourselves. What we ought to be striving for, I believe, is integration, and to remove those aspects within ourselves that block such integration. We all ask the question, who am I? When really we ought to be asking, how am I doing? And if we are still feeling utterly disconnected, we need to ask why. And how do we integrate? How do I integrate once again? You see, if we begin to integrate with all that is and all that has been and all that will ever be, we begin to cohere. That's how it's done. In so doing, we transcend our self-consciousness and we become conscious. We become spiritually mature. We become, like the Buddha, awake. I was thinking of this the other day as I watched Molly rolling and dancing and frolicking and wrestling and chasing with several other dogs in the park. Just delighting in their being part of something, being themselves fully awake in the world in which they lived and breathed and shared their being. She was totally free. No self-consciousness. And what a joy, what a freedom. Oh, to be so awake. So how conscious are you today? Are you truly awake? I'm going to end this little devotion with some final words of blessing. You know we all need to bless more, and we can all bless. We bless by giving ourselves wholeheartedly to life. So here's some words of blessing. Many days we share life together and flower and flow with all that is and was and ever shall be. Let us bless life, and let's do it through our thoughts, our words and our deeds, and life will bless us in return. So may the love of God be with us all, and may that love fill us with its spirit, enthuse us with enthusiasm, and may it do so in all that we feel, in all that we think, in all that we say, in all that we do. Go in love, go in peace. Amen.